Hello everyone. Welcome to Whispering Echoes. Before I start, don't forget to like, share and subscribe my channel. So let's get started. I've always prided myself on being a rational person. I'm not the kind to jump at shadows or believe in ghosts, but there's one thing that happened to me that I can't explain. I've tried to rationalize it, to chalk it up to exhaustion, stress, or just a very vivid nightmare, but deep down, I know it wasn't any of those things. What happened to me was real, and I've never been able to forget it. It all started when I moved into the old house on Willow Lane. I'd just gone through a messy breakup, and I wanted to get away from everything, my ex, the city, the memories. The house was a little run down, but it had character, and it was cheap. I was drawn to it the moment I saw it, standing there alone at the end of the street, surrounded by overgrown trees and a tangled garden. It felt like the perfect place to start over, to be alone and figure things out. The first few days were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking, cleaning, and trying to make the place feel like home. There was something about the house that felt off, but I dismissed it as just being old. The floors creaked, the windows rattled in the wind, and the lights flickered occasionally, but that was to be expected in a house this old. Then, on the fourth night, I heard the knocking. I was lying in bed, reading, when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere in the house. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, or maybe a branch brushing against a window. But the knocking continued, steady and persistent, as if someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. I got out of bed and walked through the house, following the sound. It led me to the living room, where the knocking seemed to be coming from the wall. I stood there for a moment, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The knocking continued, louder now, more insistent. I placed my hand on the wall, half expecting to feel something on the other side, but there was nothing, just cold, hard plaster. I told myself it was nothing, just the house making noises, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The knocking echoed in my mind, over and over again, until I finally drifted off, exhausted. The next morning, I checked the wall where I'd heard the knocking, but there was nothing there, no marks, no signs of damage. I tried to forget about it, to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of unease lingered. That night, the knocking came again. This time, it was louder, more urgent, and it wasn't just in the living room. I could hear it all over the house, on the walls, the floors, even the ceiling. It was as if the house itself was alive, and it was trying to tell me something. I was too scared to move. I just lay in bed, clutching the blankets, my eyes wide open, listening to the knocking that seemed to come from every corner of the house. It went on for hours, or maybe it was just minutes, it felt like an eternity. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat in bed, waiting for the knocking to start again, but it didn't. When morning finally came, I got out of bed and searched the entire house, looking for any explanation for what I'd heard, but there was nothing. I started to feel like I was going crazy. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, or maybe a problem with the plumbing, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something was wrong with the house, something I couldn't explain. The days passed, and the knocking continued. It happened every night, sometimes early in the evening, sometimes in the middle of the night. It was always the same, steady, rhythmic, and impossible to ignore. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped doing anything other than listening to that infernal knocking. It was driving me mad, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I felt like the house had some kind of hold on me, like I couldn't escape even if I wanted to. Then, one night, something changed. The knocking started as usual, but this time, there was something different about it. It was slower, more deliberate, almost like a heartbeat. I got out of bed and followed the sound, as I had done so many times before, but this time, it led me somewhere new. The knocking was coming from the basement. I'd avoided the basement since I moved in. It was cold, damp, and smelled like mold, and there was something about it that made me uneasy. But that night, I felt compelled to go down there, as if the knocking was calling me, drawing me in. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew colder as I descended, and the smell of mold grew stronger. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was making the noise knew I was coming. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I shone the flashlight around the basement. It was just as I remembered, dark, musty, filled with old, forgotten things. But there was something new, something I hadn't seen before. There, in the far corner of the basement, was a door. I walked over to it, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was old, much older than the rest of the house, and it was made of heavy, dark wood. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years, maybe even decades. But the knocking was coming from behind it, loud and clear. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct told me to turn around, to run, to get out of that house and never look back. But I couldn't. I had to know what was behind that door. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The first thing I noticed was the smell, stale, musty, with a hint of something foul. I shone the flashlight into the room and saw that it was small, barely bigger than a closet. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were jars, dozens of them, filled with some kind of murky liquid. But it was what was on the floor that made my blood run cold. There, in the center of the room, was a figure, curled up in a ball. It was small, no bigger than a child, and its skin was pale, almost translucent. It was naked, and its body was twisted in a way that didn't seem natural, like it had been broken and then put back together wrong. The figure was trembling, its back to me, and I realized with horror that the knocking had stopped. The room was silent, except for the sound of my own breathing. I wanted to run, to get out of that room and never come back, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the figure on the floor, my flashlight shaking in my hand. And then, slowly, the figure began to uncurl. It turned its head to look at me, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Its eyes were black, completely black, with no whites, and they seemed to bore into me, like it could see into my very soul. Its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to do anything but stare into those black, soulless eyes. The figure began to move, slowly, awkwardly, like it wasn't used to its own body. It crawled toward me, its limbs bending at odd angles, its movements jerky and unnatural. I wanted to run, to get away from that thing, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my legs refusing to obey me. It reached out a hand, its fingers long and thin, like the legs of a spider. The hand touched my leg, and I felt a jolt of cold shoot through my body. It was like being touched by death itself. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The figure froze, its hand still on my leg, its black eyes staring up at me. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, it spoke. "Help me. I don't know how I found the strength to move, but somehow, I did." I yanked my leg away from its grasp and stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight in the process. It hit the floor and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for the light, my hands shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the figure moving in the darkness, shuffling toward me, its breathing heavy and labored. Finally, I found the flashlight and switched it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, and I saw the figure again, closer this time, its hand reaching out for me. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I just ran, up the stairs, through the house, and out the front door. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, my lungs burning, my legs trembling. When I finally stopped, I turned around and looked back at the house. It was dark and silent, just as it had been when I first arrived. There was no sign of the figure, no sign of anything unusual. It was as if nothing had happened. "Sorry about that. Let's continue where we left off." But I knew that wasn't true. I had seen it, felt it. That thing in the basement was real, and I couldn't go back there. I couldn't stay in that house another night. I went to a motel on the edge of town and checked in for the night. The clerk gave me a strange look when I handed him my ID, but I didn't care. I just needed to be somewhere safe, somewhere far away from that house. The room was small and smelled faintly of mildew, but it was warm and dry, and that was all that mattered. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted. But even though I was safe, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the basement, those black, soulless eyes staring into mine. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sunlight was streaming in through the thin curtains, and for a moment, I almost convinced myself that it had all been a dream, some horrible nightmare brought on by stress and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I packed my things and left the motel without looking back. I didn't even bother going back to the house to get the rest of my stuff. I didn't care about any of it anymore. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. I drove for hours, not knowing where I was going, just following the road wherever it took me. I didn't stop until I was halfway across the state, in a small town where no one knew me. I found a cheap apartment and moved in the same day. It wasn't much, but it was a place to sleep, a place where I felt safe. For a while, things were okay. The nightmares didn't come as often, and the memories of that night in the basement started to fade. I got a job at a local diner, made a few friends, and started to rebuild my life. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than before. But then, about 6 months after I left the house, the knocking started again. It was a Saturday night, and I was sitting on the couch, watching TV. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. And then, out of nowhere, I heard it, the same rhythmic, insistent knocking that had haunted me in that old house. I froze, my heart racing. The sound was coming from the front door, loud and clear. I knew it couldn't be possible, that there was no way it could have followed me here, but I couldn't ignore it. I got up, my legs shaking, and walked to the door. The knocking continued, steady and unrelenting. I hesitated for a moment, then reached out and turned the knob. The door swung open, and there was nothing there, just the empty hallway, silent and still. I stood there for a long time, staring out into the darkness, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The knocking had stopped, and the hallway was empty. I closed the door and locked it, my hands trembling. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that it was probably just a neighbor knocking on the wrong door, but I knew that wasn't true. The knocking came again the next night, and the night after that. It was always the same, slow, deliberate, as if it was trying to get my attention. I started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't help. The knocking followed me, no matter where I went. I tried to ignore it, tried to go on with my life as if everything was normal, but it was impossible. The knocking consumed my every thought, every moment. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything else. It was driving me mad, just like it had in that old house. I knew I had to do something, had to find a way to make it stop. I started researching the history of the house, trying to find out if there was some kind of explanation for what was happening to me. I scoured the internet, went to the local library, even contacted a few paranormal investigators, but no one could tell me anything useful. And then, one day, I found something. It was an old newspaper article, dated over 100 years ago. It was about a man who had lived in the house on Willow Lane, a man who had gone mad and murdered his entire family. According to the article, he had claimed that something in the house was driving him to do it, something that had followed him wherever he went, something that wouldn't stop knocking. The article mentioned that the man had been found in the basement of the house, sitting in the dark, surrounded by jars filled with some kind of liquid. He had been holding a knife, his clothes covered in blood, but he hadn't tried to resist when the police arrived. He had just sat there, staring at the wall, muttering about the knocking that wouldn't stop. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I read the article. It was too similar, too familiar. I knew then that whatever had driven that man to madness was now coming for me. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was just a coincidence, but deep down, I knew the truth. The knocking was never going to stop. It had followed me from that house, and it was going to keep following me, no matter where I went. I started to see things out of the corner of my eye, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, shapes that didn't make sense. I could hear whispers in the darkness, voices that I couldn't quite make out. The knocking grew louder, more persistent, as if it was trying to break through the walls and get to me. I stopped going to work, stopped leaving the apartment. I couldn't risk it. I didn't know what was out there, waiting for me. I spent my days sitting on the couch, staring at the door, waiting for the knocking to start again. And then, one night, it did. But this time, it was different. The knocking was louder than ever before, so loud that it seemed to shake the walls. It was coming from everywhere, from the door, the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was as if the entire apartment was alive with the sound, vibrating with the force of it. I covered my ears, trying to block out the noise, but it didn't help. The knocking was inside my head, echoing in my mind, driving me mad. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to make it stop. I got up and ran to the door, flinging it open. The hallway was empty, just like before, but the knocking didn't stop. It was coming from inside the apartment now, from the walls themselves. I turned and saw it, the figure from the basement, standing in the middle of the living room. It was just as I remembered, small, twisted, with those black, soulless eyes and that grotesque smile. It took a step toward me, and I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. It reached out a hand, just like it had before, and I felt that same jolt of cold shoot through my body. "Help me," it whispered, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. I wanted to run, to get away from it, but there was nowhere to go. The knocking was all around me, closing in, suffocating me. The figure took another step closer, its hand still outstretched. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, smell the decay that clung to it. And then, in a moment of clarity, I realized what I had to do. I reached out and took its hand. The cold was unbearable, like plunging my hand into ice water. But I didn't let go. I held on, even as the figure's grip tightened, even as the cold spread through my body, freezing me from the inside out. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, as if it was trying to stop me. But I didn't care. I was done running, done hiding. If this thing wanted me, it could have me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The figure stared at me, its black eyes wide, its twisted smile fading. It let go of my hand and took a step back, its expression one of confusion, maybe even fear. And then, without a sound, it disappeared. I stood there for a long time, my hand still outstretched, my body trembling from the cold. The apartment was silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally moved. I walked to the couch and sat down, my mind numb, my body exhausted. The knocking was gone, the figure was gone, and I was alone. I don't know what happened that night, or why the figure disappeared when I took its hand. Maybe it was what it wanted all along, someone to acknowledge it, to face it instead of running away. Or maybe it just realized that it couldn't hurt me anymore, that I wasn't afraid of it. All I know is that the knocking hasn't come back. The apartment is quiet now, and I've started to sleep again. The nightmares are still there, but they're fading, just like the memories of that night in the basement. I've thought about leaving, about moving to a new town, starting over again. But I don't think it matters where I go. Whatever it was that haunted me, it's gone now, and I don't think it's coming back.